Today on Young Heretics, I'd like to address what might be the question of our age. And that is, do you think that you just fell out of a coconut tree? Or do you exist in the context of all that came before you? Okay, these are the questions for which we can, nay must, turn to the Western canon. And I am only a little bit joking. We are journeying through the Homeric mythic cycle, the story of the Trojan War and the journey of the heroes back home to Greece, the Achaeans who came to avenge the abduction of Helen and all that went before and after. Last week was all about prophecies and about the journey to Troy. I was talking about the surrounding stories that had kind of grown up around the outbreak of this war, some of the stuff that's not in the Iliad that is nevertheless closely associated with this story, especially of Achilles and Odysseus making their way to what would be this fateful war. And that led us into talking about prophecies and whether these characters who became so indelible so quickly in the minds of the ancient Greeks and basically everyone thereafter, whether these characters know that they are in the story they're in. Obviously, in our lives, we don't know how our story is going to end, but some of us, at least, have a sense of being in a story, that there's a point and a purpose, a trajectory to our lives. And this is one of the things we express in the great narratives, the great legends that we tell, is this idea that there's a contour and a structure to human life. And maybe even if we could just unlock the patterning in it, we might be able to take an active role, to participate in our own story. There's a famous opening line from Charles Dickens' David Copperfield, which is kind of his autobiographical novel, although it's a fictional version. And it goes something like, whether I am to be the hero of my own life or whether that belongs to somebody else these pages must show. In other words, it's only by telling our story that we come to understand our role in it. And sometimes you can only understand that role backwards. And a lot of these questions are already contained in the Iliad, and they're especially contained in the character of Achilles, who, above all else, in the original text of the poem, and not just in the surrounding mythology, Achilles is in a story and knows he's in a story. He doesn't know how the story is going to end, but he knows the structure of the paths that he can take. He has two big options that determine everything else he does. Now, this is really the key. This prophecy is really the key to understanding the whole poem, I think. And it will help you to avoid a lot of pretty dumb modern things that people say about the poem. One of the hardest, but also the most rewarding things about reading ancient literature is to reconfigure your brain, reorient your outlook, so that you can understand not just how the story strikes you, but what the whole network of narrative and the whole structure of meaning is supposed to do in its context. So it really does get determined by the context of all that came before it, as Kamala Harris so eloquently reminds us. And once again, the poem doesn't go in the kind of chronological order that we might expect. A lot of the information would be known going in, and some of the information is dropped at strategic points in the story. And this is one example. We don't begin with, once there was a man named Achilles, and there was a prophecy that his mother, Thetis, who was a goddess, had delivered to him so that he knew how things were going. People that went in for the first hearing of these poems, and certainly later audiences, would almost certainly have known and had this in mind, but Homer saves the expression of it, the relation of this prophecy, for a very key moment, and that's in Book 9, which is where Achilles has already backed out of the fight. He's already left his fellow Achaean Greek soldiers to die. And the Greeks are now begging him to return because they realize that Agamemnon has made a huge error in insulting Achilles' honor, and they want him back. They need him back if they're going to win the war, and they're dying and suffering terribly. So they come to plead with him in a way that we can readily understand. This part of it, the poem, doesn't require us to think out of our own attitudes at all. It's very easy to think, well, of course, Achilles must come back. All of these people, these innocent people, are dying because of him, because of his choice. What's not so easy to understand is why he made that choice in the first place, because the system of values that led him into that choice is one that we are less familiar with in the modern world, that we've become even maybe a little bit allergic to. And it has to do with honor culture. It has to do with a society that rewards great deeds with honor and punishes evil or ignoble deeds with shame. It's a social structure that ascribes glory and rewards good deeds with glory. And this is effectively the choice or the promise that Achilles has to grapple with. And it's a choice that is explicitly meant to compensate for death. If there is one fact that hovers over the whole of the Iliad, it's that men die. This is not the Christian world, which even if you are not a Christian, you live in the world that was described by Christianity through Europe to you, down through this inheritance of the West, this idea that our souls have a trajectory beyond death, where our good deeds will find an answer, maybe even a reward, where our evil deeds might also stick with us or torment us or plague us. That whole system of supernatural, eternal consequences after death has kind of replaced the idea that we need urgently, in order for our actions to have merit, we need public social recognition. Now, of course, this is still a natural human desire to want to be recognized for good things, praised for the good, and blamed for the bad, and justice. Our sense of justice remains intact. But we have noticed over time that the world doesn't usually, or at least doesn't always, reward justice in the way that justice deserves, and doesn't give good fame and good honor to good deeds. In fact, there's a lot of injustice in the world. And the Greeks were aware of this too, but they didn't have, or at least there wasn't a widespread conviction that somewhere beyond this life there would be an answer or a reward that could compensate and right the wrongs, that could set these imbalances aright. And so the urgent importance of rewards and honor and fame in the here and now is so powerful and so real to these characters that we actually have to think our way into that. Even if you personally don't believe in an afterlife, you have to reckon with the way in which your ingrained impulses, the little motions of your heart and the way you feel about things, has still been shaped by this vision that there is something like cosmic justice. There's something like a system of balance that hangs in place and makes sense somewhere beyond our flawed human systems, that even if nobody sees you do a good deed, it's still somehow good, and there's somehow a reward for that. Among the Greek audiences and listeners for the Iliad, it's not that they didn't know that we ought to have justice. Justice was a very present and powerful reality for the thinkers of the ancient Greek world. But there was a lot more uncertainty and ambiguity and maybe even anxiety or existential dread about the possibility that that sense of justice might just be a human thing. It might not get an answer from the cosmos. The cosmos might be less concerned with justice than we are, and might not particularly care that we be treated fairly in the long run, in the eternal run. And this is where you get that sense of real foreboding that comes from polytheism, that comes from all these different gods fighting and sometimes seeming indifferent to the suffering of humanity. The the sense that pervades these poems is if we are going to get justice as humans, then we're going to have to get it from one another. It's human society that has to answer the human need for justice, and it has to do that in the context of a universe that may or may not be set up to allow us to do that, that might not be interested in our petty human concerns about reward and honor and justice and so forth. And this is how we have to understand the obsession, and it is an obsession, with the concept of kleos. Here's one of those great sort of untranslatable Greek words, a lot like logos, which we've talked a lot about on this show. Kleos we've talked less about. Different translations will give you something like glory, fame, renown, honor, and it is all of those things. In its etymological root, it means that which is called out and heard. So it's when you get this recognition in some way that is told about in human society for the goodness of your deeds or the rightness of your deeds. And if you don't get that validation from your social circle, from the network, the community that you live in, it's even kind of unclear how real the goodness of the deed is. Because what does it matter for you when you go down into the dust? And the place that you go after death in these poems is famously shadowy and sort of insubstantial. It's not totally clear how conscious we remain after death or what these shadows, ghosts are that live on in the afterlife. But the kind of immortal life that you can go for is the kind of life that comes through kleos, that is the preservation of your memory among the people that you lived with and fought with and died for and who honored you. And that's why the poem itself is an argument for itself, because the greatest kleos of all is to have a song that is sung about you for generations and generations. And Homer is very aware and doing a lot to play with the fact that he is making Achilles' kleos. This poem is Achilles' reward for the death that he suffered, because remember we talked last week about the fact that he's not in any way invulnerable in this poem. That is a later idea, or at least an idea that doesn't come into the poem. Achilles in the poem is totally vulnerable, and he is acutely aware of the need for this recognition and the emptiness, or at least the uncertainty, of everything outside that little light of human celebration. When the embassy comes to meet him in Book 9, one of the most beautiful moments for me in the poem is that they discover him on the shore, nursing his wounded pride for having had his war prize taken away by Agamemnon, and he's playing a stringed instrument, a lyre, and he's singing Clea Andron, the glorious deeds of men. So he's singing songs just like the Iliad, and that means he's singing just the kind of song that he hopes will one day compensate for the awful fact of his mortality and the void or the unknowing or the dark shade that lies beyond death. That's what's bound up for him in this prophecy that I'm about to read to you. And he cites it. It's no accident that he cites it now in this conversation with the Greek leaders, including Odysseus, who have come to try to talk him back into the war. And he gives his own apologia pro vita sua, his own explanation for what he's done, which is one of the things we need most to hear and understand in the poem, because otherwise we're tempted to think of him as this prima donna, as sort of a preening, self-satisfied star actor who just storms off to his trailer the minute he doesn't get the right color of jelly beans he likes. And you hear people talk about the poem this way all the time. Oh, it's just a story about a big man and having a snit, and it just shows how people's egos get in the way. And that's, to me, a profound misreading of the poem, and in some sense disrespectful and prideful on our part, from the thousands of years of history that we have and our nice little belief, comfortable belief we have that justice is rewarded, that justice has more than a human source, that it is eternal, that it's absolute, that it's objective, all these things that we take for granted even if we don't have a coherent theology or worldview about them. This is something that a lot of people just don't realize how deeply ingrained that sense is and the comfort that that idea brings. none of that is there for Achilles. And so to accuse him of egotism is to fail to listen to him, fail to hear him and see him. Here's what he says in Book 9. He says, and as always, I'll read to you my own translations here, and that's an exercise for me. It helps me to grapple with the poem and the concepts like kleos that are unique to it, that don't necessarily easily make a transfer into the modern world, but also hopefully it'll be fun and cool for you to hear a new version of the poem. He says, "My mother told me, the goddess Thetis with her silver sandals, if I stay here and fight with the Trojans around their city walls, the way back home is lost to me, but my glory will never wane. If I go home to the land of my fathers, the land I love, then my noble glory is lost, but life to a ripe old age will await me, and no swift death will come to bring my end." That's the fact that you need. Those two options are all you need to understand the poem as it's intended to be understood and received. Very important in any work of literature, to be reading it the way it was meant to be read. And of course, there are things that remain constant about human nature throughout time, but there are also things like this that you really have to think your way into. And what's so enduringly great about the poem, or the two Homeric poems, is that even though in the Iliad there is definitely a choice that Achilles makes here, the poem, and Achilles himself specifically, is capacious enough, great enough in soul and in mind, that it's not clear what the right answer is. The two options are you fight and die in glory and you gain kleos, you gain fame, or you live as much life as you can, as much humble, simple pleasure, breathe as much air as you can, drink good wine, spend time with friends, all the things that we still love about life and don't want to take our leave of. And you never get any other reward. The reward is life. And this is still a conundrum, a choice that we face when people go off to war, when they sacrifice the comfort of their homes, the comfort of their small but pleasant lives. They have to think that they're getting something in return on the other side. And a classic example from our modern legendarium is J.R.R. Tolkien, right? Frodo leaves the Shire. Sam, especially, leaves the Shire and all the nice warmness and fire and everything, because they know that on the other end of that is not just glory, but if they stay, this life will fall apart. And that gradually dawns on them as the story goes on, that you can't actually just indulge in these humble country pleasures when there is a war brewing farther afield. That's not the same thing as what happens with Achilles exactly, because we will find out in a moment here that it's not really like he's worried the Trojans are now going to come pillage his land. That's not the concern. They're not an invading force. Troy is not an imperial power of that extent. They're not like the Persians, who came from even further to the east to actually attack Greece and to try to assimilate the Greek-speaking peoples into their empire. It's just that there's been an insult to the honor of specifically Menelaus, and then more broadly, the whole family that includes Agamemnon, and even more broadly still, this coalition of Greek-speaking peoples that is building as the poem goes on, or has been built right before the poem opens. And so for Achilles, it really is a question whether these pleasures of life outweigh the glory of death. And in the poem, he has to make the choice to go to his death, both because that's how the story goes, that's the story he's living in, but also because the life that he might live, however pleasant it might be, is bound to end one way or another. The central tragic reality in the poem is that even if he lives out his long life, he's still going to die. And then what will he have? Later on, though, in the Odyssey, we meet him again as a shade, as a shadow in the land of death. And it seems like he can't get any enjoyment out of his kleos, his fame, after all, anyway, because there's nothing there really left of him to enjoy, that he would rather be a slave, he says, on the earth, working the land and breathing the free air without any of this glory. So the poem genuinely presents an answer, but does not have a good answer to the problem of death. And this is why it's frequently described as a tragedy or a proto-tragedy. I've mentioned before that Aeschylus, the great tragedian, said all of his tragedies were just slices from the banquet of Homer. And that's not just because it was a storehouse of myths. It's because this attitude, the unflinching and mournful attitude toward human life that Homer expresses so beautifully and so nobly through the character of Achilles, is the attitude of tragedy. It's an incredibly brave and courageous attitude, if you think about it, when there has been no gospel, no good news that, in fact, our lives persist after death. This is the condition of humanity. And I think one of the things we don't maybe draw often enough from a study of the West is to take seriously what the world looks like before people take up this promise that there is a resurrection, that there's a life after death. Even if you, again, don't believe in that life, you do have to be manly and sober enough, or womanly and sober enough, to reckon with what the world then looks like. And I think one of the things we most admire in a poet like Homer is that he is forthright about the open ends, the unresolved problems, the grief and the tragedy of a world without sure knowledge about the final answer to our questions and our problems of justice. Now, I'm not saying this to insist that the Christian answer is the right answer to those questions, although I do believe that. I'm only saying it to point out that the Christian answer is an answer, and Christians believe, a reason why Christians rejoice about the resurrection is because Christians believe that that was a confirmation. That was a certain statement about the fact that justice endures, that it's not just a human mind groping for in its own shape for some kind of order that it can understand, but that our minds are actually imprinted with an order that is networked throughout the whole of reality. And that hope, that idea, is what the Greek concept of logos expresses, but it was never quite clear whether logos actually did organize all of creation or whether creation was actually governed by conflicting powers that were at war with each other in the form of the Greek pantheon. That's the depth of wisdom expressed in the Greek pantheon, and in this picture of the world that Homer presents as ruled over by these capricious fighting alternative powers, and that's the world that Achilles has to navigate. And the reason he's such an amazing character is that he knows with a sharper degree of clarity than anyone else in the poem what a raw deal that is. He's got every gift you could imagine that you would need to navigate this world, and still he's faced with an impossible choice, as starkly as anybody can be, in the form of this prophecy that he gets from his mother Thetis. And in this dialogue, in this exchange, it's often been noted by scholars that he exhibits a degree of sophistication and even a sort of nihilism or postmodernism about the whole war. He's not only capable of engaging in that war to its fullest within its cultural logic, the logic of honor and glory and recompense and war, he's also capable of surpassing and transcending that cultural logic and questioning whether its fundamental premises really hold good or true. This is evident from Book 1. This is something that happens right at the outset as the quarrel breaks out between Achilles and Agamemnon, but it also comes back again in Book 9. But let me just read to you a passage here from Book 1 that I think is really striking in this way. He's talking to Agamemnon here and saying, basically, this is why I came to war, was for glory, and if you won't give me that glory, then everything is just death. It's just, I might as well have stayed home and lived as much life as I could and enjoyed life to the fullest before passing away into shadow and vapor. So he says, the only reason I came here was in order to win my eternal fame. It wasn't because of the Trojan spearmen I came to this place to fight. Not me. They never gave me any cause to blame them. So here is where he says, right, the Trojans are no threat to me. If they came to my home, I would beat them back. They don't want to come to my home. They never did. I'm not avenging my own wrong. It wasn't because of the Trojan spearmen I came to this place to fight. Not me. They never gave me any cause to blame them. never once chased off my horses or cows from their pasture. No, not in Thea, the land of deep soil that nourishes men with a harvest they never disturbed. There's too much distance between us, shadowy mountain ranges and echoing, crashing oceans. It was you that we followed, you shameless disgrace. To satisfy you and your honor, we came to win payback for Menelaus and you from the Trojans, you mangy dog, and none of that gives you a moment's pause. So he's reproaching Agamemnon here with his insensitivity, his indifference to the logic or the necessity that has brought Achilles here, which is a logic that Achilles knows even better than Agamemnon can fathom, because later on in Book 9, he even asks whether that was the right choice for the Greeks to make, to come to war at all. He says, don't other men love their wives? Don't other, even minor soldiers, want to stay home in comfort? We're here because we believe that if one man's honor and one man's security at home is threatened, then the whole network, the whole social set of interactions that creates honor is threatened. But Achilles is ready to even ask whether that network is itself worthwhile. And this makes him, in some sense, the first Western hero. It makes him essentially, I think, Western in a way that will only become clear as the centuries roll on. This capacity to be in a story, but also to look outside of this system and ask whether the system itself even works. This is one of the reasons why I get a little bit head up, and I do get kind of pressed, I know, when I encounter these arguments that the West is chauvinistic, that it's hostile to other cultures, that Western white patriarchy has only ever been imperialist and has only ever tried to downplay other cultures or degrade other cultures. From very early on, especially in Homer, but also in Aeschylus, for example, the Persians, Western civilization, and Greek civilization especially, was good at this, has been marked, defined by its ability to live into a system, to believe in a homeland and the set of values and set of principles, but also to encapsulate, to think about that whole system as a whole and consider it as one among a range of possible ways that you could live, and to ask whether maybe the Persians do some things better, or maybe it would be better for us to live peaceably and rather than trying to avenge this petty slight and this quarrel between princelings. That's why the Trojans are portrayed, it's one reason why the Trojans are portrayed so nobly and admirably in this poem. They're very beautiful people. They don't have some sort of unrecognizable, evil, dark, twisted nature. They're basically human. They seem to worship even the same gods, and Homer translates their worship into the forms and the names of Greek language and religion. And they don't come across as inescapably foreign at all. They're human, but they live differently. And Achilles is willing to ask whether living differently might not be better than the situation that they're currently in. And that's what we have to do if we want to get the full scope of this poem. And that's why it's such a disservice to the poem when people say, oh, he was just throwing a hissy fit. He was just being a pissy little diva or prima donna. And you see this especially, I think, in readings of the poem that want to accuse the Greek soldiers of some kind of toxic masculinity. And I've seen this, for example, from Emily Wilson in some of her interviews, this idea that the whole thing could have just been avoided if those big chest-thumping, nasty men had sat down and listened to their prudent women. And people like Andromache, Hector's wife, who tell them to stick around in Troy and defend the battlements more cautiously and don't throw your life away in this suicidal quest for honor. Well, the poem is big enough to acknowledge that there is a reasonable way to take that point of view, that it's not crazy to think you actually shouldn't be doing this at all. In fact, the greatest heroes are aware of that possibility, and yet they also can see that the world without cosmic justice, or without the guarantee of cosmic justice, doesn't give humans any good option that will perfectly satisfy and erase the tragedy from human life. Human life just is tragedy in these stories, and the whole nobility and the doomed grandeur of it all is bound up in the responses that these heroes are able to come up with, the greatness that they're able to display in defense, in the midst of the fact that, as the poem says, all human life is like leaves, generations of leaves, the races of men. They come and they go. And this is why one of Nietzsche's greatest observations, I'm sort of on the fence about Nietzsche about a lot of things. I'm not his biggest fan in the world, but he was unquestionably brilliant. And his earliest work that really made a splash, although it was very controversial at the time, is about the birth of tragedy. And people don't really remember this, but this early Nietzsche work, The Birth of Tragedy, is subtitled Hellenism and Pessimism. And the opening, as well as some of the later stuff that Nietzsche wrote looking back on this book, is all about what a supposedly counterintuitive idea it is that Hellenism is pessimism, that the Greek outlook is a pessimistic outlook. Because at the time, in the 19th century, and even still now to a certain extent, there was this idea about Greek culture that it was brightly optimistic, that it had this high view of human life and all the glories that could be seen and shown by a really wonderful specimen of humanity. If you think of Greek culture this way, and you want to portray it this way, and you think of especially the 5th century sort of cultural flowering in the 5th century BC in Athens, people cite Protagoras, man is the measure of all things. They cite more generally this sense that human beings are this glorious creature endowed with an almost godly faculty of reason, able to ascend to these enormous heights, and that's why they were always building those great temples and making all that great art. That's what inspired them to press forward into these glamorous and beautiful civilizational achievements, and what inspired them to stick to their guns against the Persians was this notion of human freedom and dignity and all these things that we now elevate and recognize in modern liberal societies. So that was this idea that this is a really optimistic view about what humans can achieve and who they are and what they can accomplish. Nietzsche, with his characteristic dry wit and acerbic observational style, says, no, you've got that all exactly backwards. Optimism is only the surface of Greek culture. It's the final product of a long and deeply pessimistic engagement with the existential horrors of human existence. And here's some of what Nietzsche has to say. So in order to get into this, you have to understand that Nietzsche views the Homeric spirit and the tragic spirit as the pinnacle expression of what the Greeks could see and understand about life, and then the Socratic optimism. He kind of puts Socrates as this, if not villain, then the counterpoint, negative side of the story, that this Socratic optimism that we are going to be able to figure everything out, that the world should answer to our categories of logic and reason, and things like justice aren't simply human inventions or constructs, but rather reach beyond into the structure, the logos of the world. Nietzsche thinks that this was a foolish, or at least a doomed Socratic endeavor that tried to wipe away all the uncomfortable things that manlier, stronger tragedians were able to look at. Here's what Nietzsche says. He says, Socrates is the archetype of the theoretical optimist who, in the belief in the fathomableness of the nature of things, attributes to knowledge and perception the power of a universal medicine, and sees in error and evil. To penetrate into the depths of the nature of things and to separate true perception from error and illusion appeared to the Socratic man the noblest and even the only truly human calling, just as from the time of Socrates onward the mechanism of concepts, judgments, and inferences was prized above all other capacities as the highest activity and the most admirable gift of nature. Even the sublimest moral acts, the stirrings of pity, of self-sacrifice, of heroism, and that tranquility of soul, so difficult of attainment, which the Apollonian Greek called sophrosune, were derived by Socrates and his like-minded successors up to the present day. So this contrast between the Apollonian reason the Apollonian mask of composure and reason and understanding, is for Nietzsche set against the Dionysian tragic perception. He says, from the periphery of the circle of science has an infinite number, the periphery of the circle of science has an infinite number of points, and while there is still no telling how this circle can ever be completely measured, yet the noble and gifted man, even before the middle of his career, inevitably comes into contact with those extreme points of the periphery where he stares at the inexplicable, where he here sees to his dismay how logic coils round itself at these limits and finally bites its own tail. Then the new form of perception discloses itself, namely tragic perception, which, in order even to be endured, requires art as a safeguard and remedy. Nietzsche was such a phenomenal writer, and this is a powerful assessment, a powerful attack upon the picture of the Greek world as fully and exhaustively described as perfectly rational. Nietzsche saying, no, the rationalism of Greek culture, the optimism about human understanding, was a later response to a much more profound pessimism and a strong and bold readiness to peer into the inexplicableness of things, the void of chaos and dysfunction. And this is why I think Nietzsche, it's fair to say, Nietzsche would interpret the Greek myths this way, as saying that that's why chaos is first. And then you have these dyads like Uranus and Gaia and Zeus and Hera, these male-female god pairings that create order, but they have to impose it on a fundamental reality of chaos. And of course, you can see why Nietzsche would have been interested in interpreting the Greeks and understanding the Greeks this way, because he too wanted to say this about the 19th century, that it had this veneer of scientific optimism. Yes, we can understand things. We can peer back into history and see that Darwin and the apes and, mankind is descended from these different species of animal. And in fact, that's gradually, we get an evolutionary view of how things work. And Nietzsche, in another book, Daybreak, has this very sinister, but sinister in a knowing kind of way, assessment of all this. He says, you think that's going to get you to objective morality? You think that if God is dead and those things don't come from above into the world, then you can derive them from the ground up? No, my friend. That's where these human morals are going to reveal themselves to have a genealogy, to have a history and a past that reveals them to be contingent and subject to critique and able perhaps to be jettisoned altogether in favor of the raw truth of strength against strength and violence and the that's the transvaluation of all values. Of course, that is not my perception or understanding of the whole of things. In my opinion, Socrates and the effort to make the world make sense was really peering toward this deep intuition that we have that our logic, our reason, which is just as natural to us as our death, actually points at something that we can't see or touch in this real world, but that does find answer in the cosmos. But in order to believe that, you have to grapple with the fact that that is a thing that you have to receive from outside. You can't prove from within the cosmos that everything hangs together in this bounded system. And the effort to prove that was what ultimately proved the exhaustion of paganism, because paganism begins, as Nietzsche, I think, rightly observes, with a much more raw encounter with reality as not necessarily conditioned by or answerable to the impulses that we find in our human heart and the moral sense that we want to apply onto the world. We find in us this template of good and evil, of right and wrong. We want to stamp it onto the world. We want to believe that the world is waiting to be stamped, that it has that same pattern imbued into it. And the philosophical tradition was all basically a project to try to reveal that that pattern was there, but there was always the haunted, tragic sense that at the edges of that circle, as Nietzsche describes it, everything breaks down, and there's always something that we can't incorporate into our system. And in order to make sense of that, we have to get some message from outside the system that says, nevertheless, the pattern does extend on into infinity. These are the sorts of things that you really have to wrestle with if you want to understand the poem in its own terms and to acknowledge not simply its beauty as something you can relate to, and these characters do have a lot of relatable moments that we can totally understand, but also it as something with real difference that comes from another time when people didn't necessarily believe with the same deep-set conviction we have in the intelligibility of the world, in the answerability of the world to our human rational categories. It is, once you start getting into talking about these things, it is amazing how fertile this one poem is. And by the way, I've been telling you all these stories, getting you up to the point of the Iliad. We're really only now breaking into the poem, and it's going to be next week that I set us off on the actual course of the story. And I'm actually going to treat the story itself within the poem at a fairly brisk pace. So I will tell you what happens within the poem's story proper, but hopefully now you can see that the poem is a commentary or enters into this whole universe, the context of all that has gone before it. It's a great work of art because it understands that the world is bound up in these mechanisms of history and of storytelling and these structures of the human mind and of narrative that we want to see our way through and past and beyond, but we are always, in some sense, trapped within them, just as Achilles is trapped within this story that really has to go one of two ways. And he's not even sure whether it can go either way, whether it has to go in the way that the story is kind of set for him, the path is set for him up ahead. This whole series of reflections has reminded me, interestingly, of another book that I read recently that on its face doesn't have anything at all to do with Achilles or tragedy or the misreading of his character or the understanding of how he makes his choices, but actually I think is a nice little counterpoint that can help us to understand, and that is the book Shogun. So you may have seen the TV show Shogun. It's an FX show that streams on, I think, Disney Plus, or maybe Disney Plus has Hulu incorporated into it. Anyway, you can find it streaming. And it's a remake, or rather it's an adaptation, a new adaptation of a novel that has already been adapted in other ways for the screen, and which in its time in the 1970s was a massive bestseller. One of those things you would have seen on every shelf, one of those iconic paperbacks with a beautiful white cover with a samurai sword. And it's a doorstopper. It's kind of one of these epics that people used to read on planes instead of playing video games and watching movies. You used to pick up one of these great adventure stories, and they could go on for pages and pages. This one's like 1,500 pages long in the edition I read. And it's the story of the Captain John Blackthorne, who's an English sailor working for Dutch merchants, who makes his way to feudal Japan. And it's kind of set in an imaginary version of Japan right before its great unification in the early modern period. Japan had a long history of ruling tribal warlords. That's the world into which Blackthorne enters. And I really loved this TV show for the first maybe 5 episodes. And then I made the terrible mistake of picking up the book and starting to read the book. And suddenly I hated the TV show because it's one of those TV shows that's very sly about the way it does its politics, but it certainly plays politics. And I've noticed this now with a few other shows too, like House of the Dragon is another one that I've noticed, that all the politics has to do with how they have selected which material to take out of the book and which to leave and not show. And it really reveals this very modern and snide, kind of supercilious or prideful attitude about the book, which isn't that old. It's from the 1970s, but they clearly think it's not enlightened enough because it portrays some of the barbarities of Japanese culture at that time in the early modern era when Europe and Japan were first making contact with each other. And if you watch the show, they very, very intentionally make it so that Blackthorne is just a doofus fumbling his way along, and it's the Japanese that have all the wisdom, all the nobility, all the ancient culture, and this is just a barbarian that needs to be civilized by the Japanese because Europe bad, white man bad, Japan good, Japanese people good. And what's so frustrating about this and such a terrible missed opportunity is that if you read the book, it's much, much smarter about exactly this. It's not a jingoist book at all. In fact, James Clavell, the author who seems to have developed, somebody online said to me they thought it was almost Stockholm Syndrome. He was a prisoner of war, a prisoner of the Japanese in war, and terribly mistreated, but also learned this enormous amount about Japanese history and culture and Asian history and culture more generally, clearly suffered from a sort of PTSD, wouldn't talk about his war experience for years and years, and then suddenly started writing these books that are filled with detail. And yeah, some of it he gets wrong. It's a novel. It's not a work of nonfiction, but they're filled with detail and, more importantly, with respect and admiration for this ancient Japanese honor culture. And it is an honor culture that in some ways really reflects some of the same ideas that I've been talking about in Achilles' world, that these warrior communities, these warrior tribes, need to recognize one another in order for order to hold good. The cosmos itself is not going to give you honor, is not going to give you glory, is not going to make sense or hang together, but is much more of a kind of bubble in a stream. It's got this combination of Shintoism and Buddhism in the background. The metaphysics of it is the universe might not really care too much about our fleeting human desires and perceptions, and anything that we do to create order for human people, human beings, on their human terms, is going to be generated from this human system of honor and shame. And so they take these honor questions so seriously as to die over them. They obviously, characters in it are always committing or offering or asking to commit seppuku, to kill themselves or to go into battle to die gloriously. And Blackthorn is appalled by this. But what Clavel does so beautifully is he does not portray Blackthorn as having all the good European answers in the civilized way of looking at things. He rather shows that Christianity is an actually incommensurable different system, different way of looking at the world because of its eternal viewpoint, because of its value for human life above all other things, and that each of these societies has ways in which they are barbaric and ways in which they are beautiful and worth dying for, worth loving and living in. And it's the contact between them that is expressed in this incredibly hot romance between Mariko, the Japanese woman, and Blackthorn, the Englishman, that shows you how there's a kind of translation that goes on between these two civilizations that doesn't elevate one or the other over each other, but just says these are two civilizations that when they first encounter one another cannot understand each other, and then gradually are able, like two lenses in a pair of glasses, to kind of adjust to one another. And I want to just read to you some passages because they cut all of this out of the show, and the love affair between Mariko and Blackthorn is shrunk down to this incredibly tiny little fleeting moment. Mariko is given none of her sense of adventure or joie de vivre, none of her kind of love of life that she has. She has this huge kind of lust for life in the book that's all taken out. And I think it's on purpose because they don't want to present to you this very honest and not pandering idea that cultures are different, and yet they can kind of like make this contact with one another. But let me read to you this one passage from a moment when Blackthorn has ordered he's got control over a samurai household, and he has ordered for a pheasant to be hung out to dry. And this is part of the barbarism of England from Japanese standpoint, which is that they eat all this meat, they don't bathe, they never clean themselves or their homes enough, and so everything is so clean and tidy. And in Japan, to raise a stench is a terrible offense to your neighbors, and that's what Blackthorn is guilty of. And he gives this kind of joking order. He has this very wry European sense of humor. He says, nobody touch this pheasant or else, right? And while he's away, the pheasant starts to stink, and they have to do something about it because there's a complaint, but the only way for them to do something about it is to disobey his orders, and they must maintain the social structure that demands the execution of anybody who disobeys the master of the house's orders. And so they end up picking this old man who's near death sort of anyway, and he basically goes to his death over this pheasant. And it's sort of like Achilles killing or letting all these Greek soldiers be killed over this seemingly inconsequential spat about these girls, these women that they've taken in battle. And similarly, this pheasant means nothing to Blackthorn, and it's just a lark, it's a bagatelle. But from within the structure of this honor culture, It's something that you have to die over, not because the pheasant is so important, but because the pheasant is now linked into this enormous structure, bound in the context of all that has come before it, threaded through this network of, well, the pheasant is connected to the order of the master, and the order of the master is connected to the piece of the house, and the piece of the house is one unit in this larger structure that goes all the way up to the daimyo, the samurai in charge of this particular allegiance, group network of allegiances, and that network is also currently up for grabs to whoever can impose order over the entire thing and rule all of Japan. And so Blackthorn has this moment where he has to realize that within that structure, he's caused the death of the man. Not the servant who ordered the death of this guy, not his consort, Fujiko, who's in charge of carrying out his wishes, but he personally. And he breaks down and cries. And Clavel writes, "He wept because a good man was dead unnecessarily and because he knew now that he had murdered him. Lord God, forgive me. I'm responsible, not Fujiko. I killed him. I ordered that no one was to touch the pheasant but me. I asked her if everyone understood, and she said yes. I ordered it with mock gravity, but that doesn't matter now. I gave the orders, knowing their law and knowing their customs. The old man broke my stupid order, so what else could Fujiko-san do? I'm to blame." So he carries his Christian sensibilities into this world. He believes that it's a terrible tragedy this man has died in a way that Toranaga, the liege lord, doesn't really mind that much. And this sort of thing is very much par for the course in the broader project of his kind of honor culture building. A Christian can't feel that way. A Christian is appalled, but he has to realize that from within this culture that he's willingly entered into, he's the one to blame because he's at the top of this network, this chain of honor and cause and effect, in just the same way that Agamemnon is to blame, really, for the fight that breaks out. And Achilles, yes, he's a hothead, yes, he has his own flaws, but he's operating in a purely rational way from within the society that he's able to critique, but nevertheless still has to live in, that is going to either reward him with kleos, eternal glory, or simply see him die like the numberless men that have gone before him. It's a profound conundrum, and anybody that tells you he's just throwing a fit or that it's a poem about an insignificant squabble hasn't taken the time to really peer into the depths of what Homer has to say. And anytime you hear somebody say that, that's how you know you don't have to listen to them about the Iliad, because Achilles is not being petty. He is trapped in the world as it looks to a culture and a society that doesn't feel confident that the world answers to human categories of justice and of reason and of goodness. Okay, next time we will break out into the quarrel proper and we will start to charge through the story of the Iliad. I'm having so much fun. I hope you are too. Write in with any questions you may have at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. I take mailbag questions every week there, and it's also a great place to read more of my writing, get some more stuff. If you're interested in a lot of the other things I make, those come up there. Okay, let me answer a mailbag question. And this one I picked because it fits really neatly with a lot of the themes we've been talking about, and also with an essay that I have coming out shortly that I hope you will enjoy reading. One more time, if you want to ask these questions, you got to go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com and either DM me or send me an email. So this is Danny. He says, "Dear Spencer, I recently read your review of Tom Holland's Dominion, which incidentally was just after putting down my copy of Hobbes's Leviathan. A question then popped into my mind. I've read arguments saying that Locke and Hobbes were atheists or secularists, but too afraid to say so because of the religious climate they lived in. I find this easier to refute for Locke, but for Hobbes, I wonder if he genuinely might have been the sort of Christian atheist you mentioned in your Tom Holland book review." So this review, which I will also link to in the show notes, is an essay I wrote in response to Tom Holland's beautiful book, Dominion, which is about some of the stuff I've been talking about today. How its subtitle is How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, and how the assumptions about justice, about order, about the cosmos, and how we fit into it, the assumptions of Christianity about those questions are in many cases fundamentally different from pre-Christian assumptions and what I would call pagan assumptions, and some of the attitudes that I've been describing in the Iliad and among the Greeks, so that we now almost can't recognize the world except by understanding it as remade by the Christian Revolution. And in my review, I wrote about the fact that many people are coming to understand this, even though they can't believe or they don't believe in Jesus and in the supernatural elements of Christianity. And this is sometimes called Christian atheism, because you want to believe in the human rights and the dignity and the order of the universe and the intelligibility without believing in the metaphysics of God made flesh and all that other stuff. And my position is that this does not work, that it ultimately doesn't hang together, because the claim that Christianity makes over and against the tragic sense of Nietzschean unintelligibility is a metaphysical claim. And it's a claim that is demonstrated, given its evidence, in the resurrection and in the physical life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's how Christianity claims to confirm our sense that there's a higher justice that goes beyond and past death and all the things that make our little human sphere unravel. So unless you believe that, you should basically be a pagan, but Tom Holland is absolutely right that you won't like the way the world looks if you go back to upending the Christian set of assumptions. And so what Danny is asking is, were Hobbes and Locke, these early modern political philosophers, kind of some of the early Christian atheists, the early believers in an idea that you could have an ordered civilization structured according to basically Christian principles of natural right and natural law and the human dignity and freedom and all this stuff, but without an explicitly Christian set of attitudes. And there is often, as Danny suggests, there's kind of a habit that people have of reading scholars from before it was generally acceptable to be an atheist, reading great thinkers who lived in a time when basically everybody believed in God, or at least said they did, and trying to claim that this or that person was a crypto-atheist because he says these things that raise very serious questions about the structure of Christianity or the veracity of Scripture or whatever, but he couldn't come right out and say it. So he had to be esoteric about it and do circumlocution and talk sort of out of one corner of his mouth. And they go in they chase in all sorts of circles to find evidence that this or that person was actually hinting his way at atheism without being able to come right out and say it. So people talk about Spinoza, and they talk about Locke, as you say, and they talk about Hobbes. And in many of these cases, I think it's impossible to get a final satisfactory answer. And for that reason, the arguments about it always seem a little motivated to me, on both sides, if I'm honest. So you get people apologizing for what Thomas Jefferson said about the Bible and about how Jesus had been misinterpreted, or there had been things interpolated into Jesus' original sayings. And sometimes when they say that, they're like, Jefferson was a better Christian than he's made out to be. And sometimes I feel like, don't you just you like Jefferson and you think he was right about a lot of stuff, and you're a Christian and you want him to be an Orthodox Christian, you want to claim him for Orthodox Christianity, you make this argument. I feel the same way about a lot of these arguments that this or that early modern thinker was a crypto-atheist. It's like, no, you just think this guy's smart, and you think that only smart people are atheists, so you are taking what he said quite plainly, which was something a little different, and you're extracting out of it this desire to be atheist before it was quite socially acceptable or appropriate to be atheist. Either way, I don't think we can ever know, because if the writer didn't write down his opinion or never said his opinion in a recorded way, then all we have to go on is the text. And generally, I think you should read the text for its implications and draw whatever conclusions you want to draw without attributing those conclusions necessarily to the author, unless he outright states that those are his conclusions. All of that having been said, with Hobbes, I think what I read in Hobbes, in Leviathan, is not necessarily Christian atheism or crypto-atheism so much as an attempt, which is very characteristic of the period, to show that the principles of Christianity can be derived without special revelation, that they're accessible to human reason and maybe even self-evident just in the world around us. My dad and I are actually talking a lot about how much of this is and isn't true a lot right now in our letter exchange at The New Jerusalem, which is also a Substack, thenewjerusalem.substack.com. And my feeling is that there are some things, since Christianity, in my opinion, contains the whole truth, some of those truths we know are accessible to human reason and self-evident. And those, I think, include things like the goodness of life, right? That these self-evident truths are accessible to human reason and have been seen everywhere. And there are wisdom traditions everywhere, not just in the Judeo-Christian stream, that access some of these truths and then are confirmed and affirmed by Christianity. And I often cite Stoicism as an example because St. Paul quoted Stoic poets and Stoic ideas when he talked to the Greeks, saying, yeah, some of your poets have already intuited a lot of this stuff. And during the sort of dawn of the modern era, and especially the Enlightenment, but also before, you get people making the argument that actually all of Christianity is like that you could have figured it all out if you had just had enough time and enough insight and enough wisdom through naked human reason. And in Leviathan, Hobbes does kind of embark on this project to say the natural state of nature is life is poor, brutish, and short. Famously, he thinks that without social structures in place, we would be brutes and animals. But people don't follow him through to the next part. He says that from that state of nature, you can build up through a logical progression the rules of basically Christian society, including that law to do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. And so in that way, I do think he suggests, if not outright saying, he sort of implies that Christianity is so true and so evident in its truth that you don't need to be told it from the outside. You can get it from the world inside out. And there, I think, he's wrong. I don't think that's true. I think that's the kind of thing you could only say from inside a culture that was so steeped in Christian history that it made Christian principles look self-evident when in fact they're manifestly not in the broader scheme of things. And actually do unto others as you would have done unto yourself is a classic example of something that the world does not always reward. So that in order to really believe in it, you can't make these game theoretical arguments that Hobbes makes. You have to make a metaphysical, eternal argument that this is the right thing to do, full stop, and there is a cosmic reward or an answer for that on the other end. And I think this problem is actually very profound because if you look at people who are more hard-charging, more direct about the idea of what can and can't be known by human reason, then you do get into some atheist territory with guys like David Hume who say, no, actually, the postulates of the human mind and the order that we seek when we look at the world might just be a feature of our minds in this kind of proto-Nietzschean way that our minds just evolved, grew up to structure our society in certain ways that are convenient, but we impose those structures onto a world that never promised to answer to them. And now that we've lost our metaphysical conviction that the world is structured, is ordered by a cosmic hand, you're starting to see these sorts of arguments creep back in. And this is where I'll give one more plug for an essay I have coming out in the Claremont Review of Books about Liu Cixin's three-body problem in the series Remembrance of Earth's Past. Because I think if you really want to look at a world where your cosmology is indifferent to humanity, but humanity still has a desire for order and understanding, you have to look at somebody like Liu Cixin because he is being honest about what the world looks like. And that also is the ideology of these totalitarian enterprises like the Chinese Communist Party. And Cixin will say things like, if you don't impose order on society, there will be chaos. And that's his view of humanity because it's his view of the world. And without a divine conviction that there is a world more generally ordered than just what we want to impose upon it, you don't get, as Hobbes wants to, you don't get to build up a civilization that operates according to tolerance and law and all these righteous principles. You can't just derive Christianity from the state of nature. And I do think Hobbes tends to want to do that. I don't know if that makes him a Christian atheist, but I do think it makes him very much a product of his time. And I think in our time, we are having to reckon with the fact that he was wrong about that without the metaphysical underpinnings of Christianity, I don't think you can really write a check and cash that check for a society structured according to the things that we all now believe in, like universal human dignity, like human rights, like all that other nice stuff, including, by the way, liberal democracy and all the other things that are supposedly under attack. If they're under attack, part of that is because we don't have a good metaphysical justification for it anymore. And I do think it was guys like Hobbes who kind of laid the groundwork for forgetting or losing that metaphysical justification. Maybe not in a sinister or a subversive way, but definitely I do think that's true. So if Hobbes is not a Christian atheist, he's on the path to the world that includes a dominant strain of Christian atheism. Cool. That was a great question. Really relevant to a lot of the stuff we were talking about with the Iliad too. I love all your questions, and I wish I could answer them all, but I will answer as many of them as I can anytime you send them in. It's rejoiceevermore.substack.com. I've been getting so many lovely notes from you recently, just in general, and one thing I love to hear is that you are young heretics pilling your friends. You guys have been telling me you've been getting your friends listening or locked into this podcast, and I really love that. I love new listeners and listeners that have been here since the very beginning, OG listeners. We're years into this project. I have no intentions of stopping. It's one of the highlights of my week, talking to you and recording this stuff. I've really especially been enjoying these Iliad episodes. So please do share the love, spread the word. If you don't mind letting your friends know, texting your group chat, tweeting about it, posting about it, just share however you like. And I'll make a plug that I don't always make, but it really does help when you give 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you're listening, and subscribe if you haven't already to get the new episodes. That does boost in the algorithm so that people can find this show and get to know the glories of Western civilization, which it is my delight to share with you. So I will continue to do that next time, and I will see you then for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.